It's where humans first set foot on American soil. A wild land that's been beckoning to outsiders ever since. Where lakes glisten like windows into parallel worlds. Giant creatures rise from the depths, and others thrive in its Arctic air. For centuries, thousands have been answering Alaska's call of the wild. In the 18th century, it was Russian traders seeking riches from fur. 100 years later, hopeful prospectors were hiking up a trail known as the meanest 32 miles in the world. And today, modern-day treasure seekers are arriving by helicopter to search for copper, silver, and gold. Many come to Alaska just to be left alone. Others to unlock the secrets of our warming planet, or to soar across the landscapes that they just can't find in the lower 48. But Alaska's postcard-perfect wilderness holds great danger too. It was here that a young survivalist met his fate after crossing a river of no return. And where one couple's experiment living with an apex predator came to a grisly end. But today, some still dare to try and cross 1,000 miles of frozen wilderness, hoping to win the last great race on Earth. All this to answer Alaska's call of the wild. Every year, Alaska's call of the wild lures a few reckless adventurers further into danger than they're ready to go. And they're not all climbing the state's snow-covered peaks. Peril often awaits those who explore Alaska's valleys too. In 1992, a young survivalist named Christopher McCandless hitchhiked into Alaska on a quest for self-discovery, inspired by writers Henry David Thoreau and Jack London. On April 28th, his last ride dropped him off at the beginning of a rugged wilderness road known as the Stampede Trail. It was first blazed across this valley in the 1930s by a prospector named Earl Pilgrim. 30 years later, the state of Alaska turned Pilgrim's Trail into a road. But a bridge was never built over one of the valley's biggest obstacles, the wild Teklanika River. When McCandless forded the Teklanika on foot that April, the water level was still low. Snow and ice on the surrounding mountains hadn't yet thawed. He made his way across and continued west on the old mining trail, hoping to walk all the way to the shores of the Bering Sea while living off the land. But as he reached this clearing, he discovered Bus 142. Workers building the road had used this 1946 International Harvester bus as a mobile shelter. McCandless also decided to use it as his base as he prepared for his journey deeper into the wild. He arrived here with not much more than a few books, a 10-pound bag of rice, a gun, and 400 rounds of ammunition. Over the next few weeks, he made forays across the valley to test how far into the wilderness he was willing to go and to find food that could keep him alive. He shot and ate squirrels, porcupines, and quail, and even a moose. But when the moose meat spoiled before he could cure it, McCandless began to realize he might be in over his head. After 2 months in isolation, he decided it was time to leave. But when he headed back down the Stampede Trail, he discovered he had waited too long. Summer snowmelt had flooded the river that he had forded in the spring. The Teklanika was now a raging torrent. McCandless knew that if he waded into its dark, turbulent waters, he would be swept away to his death. So he returned to the safety of Bus 142, with no choice but to continue his experiment in wilderness survival. But over the next few weeks, McCandless started running out of things to eat. His body grew weaker and weaker. Some say he may also have been poisoned by potato seeds that he ate in his desperation to stay alive. Slowly, he began to starve to death. As he faded away, McCandless scribbled his thoughts and emotions into a diary. In brief notes about his loneliness, hunger, and growing fear of death. Extremely weak, he wrote in one of his last entries on July 30th. Much trouble just to stand up. Starving. Great jeopardy. In his final entry, McCandless wrote, "I have had a happy life, and thank the Lord, goodbye, and may God bless all." Hunters discovered his body inside Bus 142 a few weeks later. His journal was by his side. The story it told inspired Jon Krakauer's best-selling book, Into the Wild, and a movie by Sean Penn. They transformed the wayward hiker's folly into legend and turned Bus 142 into a magnet for misfits and dreamers. As many as 100 pilgrims come here some summers to see where McCandless perished. Many don't seem to realize they're risking the same fate. In 2010, a woman who had come all the way from Switzerland to visit the bus drowned in the Teklenika in the very spot where McCandless tried to cross in '92. That hasn't stopped a steady stream of curiosity seekers from making the trek to see the abandoned bus. They risk everything just to experience Alaska's call of the wild, just as others have for thousands of years. Scientists believe that the first humans to set eyes on the Alaskan wilderness arrived here as early as 20,000 years ago. They came from what's now Siberia and traveled east on foot for more than 1,000 miles across what is known as the Bering Land Bridge, or Beringia, that once linked Asia and North America. But at the end of the last ice age, the water from massive melting glaciers covered Beringia with the Bering and Chukchi Seas. Those early travelers became the first humans to explore the North American continent. Their descendants would eventually make it all the way down to the tip of South America. Today, Alaska is still home to some of their closest kin. Here on Admiralty Island, in the little town of Angoon, members of the Tlingit Bear Clan still live in a spot their people have called home for thousands of years. Some continue to make their living by hunting and fishing, just as their ancestors did. Ancient Tlingit stories tell of a world full of spirits and of a figure called Raven that gave them many of their traditions. But in the 18th century, some ambitious newcomers from the West turned the Tlingits' traditional world upside down. Russians began settling Alaska's shores in 1784 on a search for pelts for the European fur trade and new territory for Russia's Tsar. In 1799, they arrived here in the Tlingit community of Shiatika, now the site of the Alaskan town of Sitka. After 2 years of uneasy coexistence, the Tlingit people turned on the Russians, killing most of them and driving the rest away. In 1804, the Russians returned and went to war with the Tlingit. Here in Shiatika, members of the tribe stood their ground inside a fort on a site that's now marked by this single totem pole. After a 6-day siege, the Russians finally forced their way in, only to discover that the Tlingit had escaped under the cover of darkness. The victorious Russians renamed the Tlingit village New Archangel. For the next 60 years, it served as the capital of Russia's growing North American empire, which stretched all the way down to San Francisco. But in the 1860s, Tsar Alexander II decided to sell Alaska to raise some extra cash. he found a buyer in U.S. Secretary of State William Seward, who agreed to purchase it sight unseen. On October 18, 1867, here in Sitka, Alaska was officially transferred to the United States. At a price of just over $7 million, it was quite a bargain, even at the time. That didn't stop critics who had never seen Alaska from dubbing it Seward's Folly. But those who'd actually been here knew the Secretary of State had made a very shrewd deal indeed. Covering more than 500,000 square miles, an area twice as large as Texas, it includes some of the wildest and most dramatic landscape in the nation. From pristine fjords, where towering mountains tumble right down to the sea, to an island where the largest brown bears on Earth gather to feast, to mile after mile of remote inland tundra, to the highest peak in North America, an icy world that only the hardiest adventurers dare to enter. It's easy to see how getting all this for just a few $1 million was likely one of the best investments the United States has ever made. Alaska has been a stunning jewel in America's crown ever since. Almost 40 years later, in 1906, the capital of the Alaskan Territory was moved from Sitka to a booming mining town on the mainland, known as Juneau. In 1912, a new mansion was built here for the territorial governor on this bluff overlooking downtown. With 14,400 square feet to roam, it was designed to shine like a beacon over the Alaskan Territory at a time when most people up here were still living in miners' cabins. Strangely enough, there are no roads in or out of Juneau, making it the only U.S. capital that's not accessible by car. For thousands of tourists who arrive here each spring on a fleet of giant cruise ships, Juneau's isolation is part of its charm. But there's something else that makes Alaska's capital unique. Soar over the green hills just above town, and suddenly you're in another world, flying over the massive Mendenhall Glacier. This giant river of ice stretches 12 miles. Water from melting ice at its edges cascades down into rivers below, just as it has for thousands of years. Today, the Mendenhall is one of Alaska's most visited glaciers, probably because it's so easy to reach. But travel up to its source, and it feels like you're on another planet. This is the Juneau Ice Field, a 1,500 square mile expanse of snow and ice that feeds the Mendenhall and 37 other glaciers in the region. Amazingly, the majority of this ice field is within the Juneau city limits. But there's more to see up here than just snow and ice. These tiny specks are the residents of an exclusive training camp for some of Alaska's most elite athletes, sled dogs. The extreme weather and seemingly endless snow here make the Mendenhall a perfect spot to get these dogs used to freezing conditions and prepare them for Alaska's most famous sporting event. A contest that sends dogs and humans tearing through hundreds of miles of Alaskan wilderness in a battle of endurance, strategy, and stamina they call the last great race on Earth. It's March 3rd, 2013, and hundreds of Alaskans and visitors from around the world are already gathering on a frozen lake northwest of Anchorage. They're here for the start of one of the most famous sporting events in the world, the Iditarod Trail Sled Dog Race. Over 60 drivers, or mushers, have signed up for this year's competition, a brutal 1,049-mile race across snow and ice. Here at the staging area, they're preparing their teams. Before they start, they have to check and double-check every part of the harness that ties the dogs to each other and to the sled. Any hint of a cut paw or sore leg will get a dog pulled from the team. But the mushers know it's better safe than sorry when it comes to the grueling test of stamina and endurance that lies ahead. By the time the dogs make it to the starting line, they're raring to go. Volunteers have to keep them steady. A lottery determines in which order the mushers start the race. Finally, the countdown is over. The race is on. Crowds cheer as the first musher of the 41st annual Iditarod heads out across the lake. For many here, this is the last chance for them to cheer the mushers on before they head into the wild. The mushers' starts are staggered by 2 minutes, so the dog teams don't get tangled early on the trail. Another musher heads out of the gates as rock music blares and the crowds cheer. The men, women, and dogs that compete in the Iditarod every year are joining in a long tradition. The first Alaskans used dog sleds long before Europeans arrived here. Later, Russian invaders used them too. In the 1880s, American prospectors rode dog sleds into snowy regions they couldn't get to any other way. Pioneers soon followed, settling Alaska on dog power. Today, the mushers in the Iditarod honor those days. They follow a route that was forged during a famous Alaska rescue. It happened in January 1925. The western Alaskan city of Nome was in the grip of a deadly outbreak of diphtheria. Thousands of people could die unless an antitoxin serum hundreds of miles away in Anchorage could reach them in time. To get the serum there before it was too late, 20 mushers banded together to drive their dogs across Alaska's frozen wilderness in a daring relay. They managed to deliver the serum to Nome in just 127 hours, saving the people of the city and making headlines across the nation. Today, every musher who races in the Iditarod is honoring that achievement. But this race is not a relay. Each musher has to drive his or her dogs all the way to Nome. The race begins northwest of Anchorage, at Willow Lake. From there, the teams head west, up and over Rainy Pass. Then, depending on the year, the dog sleds take a southern route via Anvik or a northern route via Galena. All teams head north past the coastal town of Koyuk. And then, after racing for almost 1,000 miles, they arrive at the finish line in Nome. Early on in the race, friends and fans line the route to encourage the musher teams as they pass in a celebration of Alaskan pride. But as the crowds thin, the mood starts to change. It's time for the mushers and their dogs to begin their journeys into the state's lonely backcountry. It will take the fastest teams 9 to 10 days to make it out again. The slower ones will likely take up to 17. The slowest musher in Iditarod history took 32 days to complete the race. Each musher has his or her own strategy and has to make careful decisions about when to rest and when to race. This one has decided to sleep during the day as other teams pass him by. But later, he'll race into the night. To make sure their dogs get rest too and to save them from frostbite, mushers put out straw to keep them off the snow. With wind chill, temperatures out here have been known to reach minus 100 degrees Fahrenheit. But this year, unseasonably warm weather threatened to leave much of the course without snow. Many feared that global warming might force the cancellation of the race. But in the end, just enough snow finally fell to make a go of it. Out on the trail, special booties protect the dog's paws from jagged ice. A team may use as many as 2,000 of them in a single race. Any dog that's injured is pulled from the team and carried on the back of the sled, like this one, until it can be handed off to vets or volunteers. Every team has to finish the Iditarod with at least 6 dogs, or else they're automatically disqualified. Fortunately, the dogs have been bred to meet the challenge. Most are a mix of indigenous Alaskan breeds, Siberian Huskies, Malamutes, and others. They rarely weigh more than 55 pounds, and most of that is pure muscle. They all have an inborn eagerness to run. Those who race the Iditarod experience parts of Alaska few others ever get to see. They wind through the quiet stillness of great pine forests covered in snow. They cross ice-choked rivers and discover what it's like to really be out in the wild in Alaska. They often find themselves all alone, tiny specks racing through an epic landscape. But every musher knows that Alaska's wilderness holds great danger too. Sudden windstorms can bring blinding snow. When the going gets tough, mushers run alongside the sled to lighten the load or use poles to help the dogs out. 27 checkpoints line the trail to provide support. Each is staffed with a volunteer vet to check the dog's condition and make sure they're fit to continue. Here at Finger Lake, mushers check in with race officials, feed their dogs, and then head to these tents to rest up for the next leg. 30 miles up the trail, the Rainy Pass checkpoint awaits on a frozen lake. Here, the teams pick up supplies flown in by a group of gung-ho volunteer pilots who call themselves the Iditarod Air Force. These men and women risk their lives to keep the mushers and their dogs safe in an area that's been called the deadliest place in Alaska to fly. From here, the teams head for the top of Rainy Pass. At over 3,100 feet, it's the highest point in the race, but still 800 miles from Nome. The winner of this year's race was 53-year-old musher Mitch Seavey, who made it to the finish line in 9 days, 7 hours, 39 minutes, and 56 seconds, the oldest musher yet to win the race. But racing a dog sled across 1,000 miles of frozen wilderness is just one way people here in Alaska get out into the wild. Others do it by scrambling up high peaks or skiing down them. But one legendary Alaskan bush pilot created his own unique experiment in wilderness survival by building a house perched on a rocky tower right in the middle of the highest mountain range in North America. A bush pilot soars across a massive glacier flowing out of the Alaska Range. This tiny speck of a machine is saving its passengers from what would otherwise be a very long and very difficult climb across one of the coldest areas on the continent. But in the high, icy reaches of Alaska's mountains, one species has evolved to be amazingly adept at survival. Mountain goats. Here, more than 1,000 feet above Juneau, these goats are right at home, where most humans would be running for cover. Tens of thousands of years of evolution are responsible. These goats live only in the rugged mountains that stretch from the northern Rockies up through Canada and into southern Alaska. They follow the seasons up and down the slopes in search of food, shedding last year's coats when spring arrives, and then fattening themselves up for the cold of winter. Between mating seasons, males stick together in bachelor groups. The babies, or kids, arrive in late May and stay with their mothers for at least a year. Most remain high in the mountains, on steep slopes that predators like wolves have a hard time climbing. One reason mountain goats are so agile is because they have an area of soft skin in the middle of their hooves that can act like a suction cup to help keep them attached to the rocks they climb. That is, when they're not fighting with each other. This species of goat is known to be highly aggressive. One year-long study revealed that they fought or poked each other with their horns 5 times an hour on average. So not only have they learned to survive brutal cold and packs of hungry wolves, but also the injuries caused by conflicts with each other. Trying to survive while climbing Alaska's highest peaks has been a challenge humans have been undertaking for more than a century. And still today, every year, more than 1,000 climbers set out to try and reach the summit of Mount McKinley, also known as Denali. At 20,237 feet, it's the tallest mountain in North America. Less than 70% of those who attempt the summit every year actually make it. As with much of Alaska, the easiest way in and out is by plane, thanks in part to the pioneering work of a legendary bush pilot named Don Sheldon. As a young man, the Colorado native kept traveling north until his money ran out. He ended up in the tiny Alaskan town of Talkeetna, where he would spend the rest of his life. In 1955, a scientist named Bradford Washburn from Boston arrived in Talkeetna to map Mount McKinley and the surrounding mountains. The problem was, he needed a pilot who could drop him off on Denali's glaciers and work for him over the years it would take to complete the survey. It just so happened that Sheldon, who was now a pilot, had recently attached a pair of special skis to the wheels of his bush plane so he could land on snow. He offered to work with Washburn and was soon teaching himself how to land and take off on glaciers, a technique that's still used today by Sheldon's daughter, Holly, and her husband, David Lee, when they ferry climbers up to the 7,200-foot-high Denali Base Camp. Sheldon's skill at glacier landings enabled Washburn to conduct the first-ever survey of Mount McKinley, which took 15 years, and helped make Sheldon one of Alaska's aviation legends. In 1966, Sheldon decided to build himself a cabin high up on Denali's flanks. He chose this rugged outcropping 6,000 feet above sea level in the glacier-filled valley known as the Great Gorge. He flew in every part of the cabin and every tool he needed to build it. Strapping the larger timber to the outside of the plane, he simply dropped it off into the snow below as he flew by. It took dozens of trips, but he finally welcomed his first guests in 1966. Almost 60 years later, visitors pay up to $600 a night to fly in and rough it in Sheldon's unique retreat, a place with no room service and few amenities, but plenty of solitude and one heck of a view. Thanks to this cabin, this area of the Denali National Park is now called the Don Sheldon Amphitheater, in honor of the famous pilot. Still today, the only way into and out of here is by plane, just as it is for many places in Alaska, especially for those who really want to test the limits of surviving in the wild. In the spring of 2003, two amateur zoologists named Amy Huguenard and Timothy Treadwell were dropped off by a bush plane here on the Katmai coast. The horrifying events that followed would make them the main characters in director Werner Herzog's documentary, Grizzly Man, and provide a cautionary tale to others about testing the raw power of Alaska's wilderness. Huguenard and Treadwell had come to try and coexist with the bears of Katmai. They lived among them and tried to become their friends, but it didn't go as they planned. The bears ended up eating both of them alive. Treadwell's video camera happened to be rolling at the time and captured 6 horrifying minutes of his agonized screams. For thousands of years, bears have reigned at the top of the food chain as Alaska's apex predator. Usually, they are fine being around humans, as long as the humans don't push their luck. Brown bears are known to eat caribou, elk, and moose. Most of the time, they feast on berries, roots, and of course, fish. Some of these grazing giants get as much as 80 to 90% of their nutrition from vegetation. And when the tide is out, they dig for clams, as opportunistic gulls wait to feast on their leftovers. Even birds know to keep their distance if they don't want to be added to the bears' buffet. The cubs are born between December and March. As soon as they leave their dens, their mothers begin teaching them how to find food. When mature, the males will weigh up to 1,000 pounds. In the 19th and 20th century, fear of these giant predators drove pioneers to hunt them to near extinction in the lower 48 states. Today, more than 95% of surviving brown bears in the United States, about 30,000 in all, live in Alaska. The park is dedicated to preserving this Eden for bears and humans alike. But not everyone comes to Alaska just to look at the wildlife or the views. Some come to search for buried treasure. Daring men and women willing to risk it all to find their fortunes on America's frozen frontier. Sometimes, out in Alaska's vast wilderness, the morning commute can be extreme. The pilot of this helicopter is on his way to pick up a mining executive waiting for a ride to work. Geologist Darwin Green is here to check in on an exploratory drill that's plumbing this mountainside for traces of precious metals. But to get there requires a hair-racing descent by helicopter. He needs to reach this tiny platform perched on the edge of the mountain down below. It's one of many such drilling rigs that dot the cliffs here. They're part of an operation called the Palmer Project, a search for copper, zinc, silver, and gold in Alaska's coast mountains. It takes skilled Alaskan mountaineers to build these platforms on such steep, rocky terrain. A century ago, prospectors would have clambered up peaks like this one on foot in the search for precious metals. But today, Darwin and the other members of his drill crew start and end their shifts by helicopter. It's not a job for anyone afraid of heights or nerve-wracking flights. And flying these kinds of missions requires a lot of skill, especially in the mountain's tricky updrafts. Today, this experienced pilot swings down over the valley, then back around to get the right angle for the approach. Once he's in position, he starts his descent to a tiny landing pad. If a gust of wind pushes him off course, the landing will have to be aborted to avoid a potentially deadly crash. But this pilot manages to make a feather-light touchdown on his very first try. It's too dangerous to park a helicopter on this temporary pad, so the pilot lifts off to seek solid ground. Now, on his own, Darwin hikes the rest of the way down to the drill site. His team's hard work is already paying off. Core samples from these drills have shown that this mountain range holds great potential riches below. Once those minerals have been carefully mapped using surface drills like this one, the mining company Darwin works for hopes to be able to extract it using underground mines. Drill crews on the Palmer Project work 24 hours a day here, in 12-hour shifts, 5 months a year, no matter what the weather. Just the latest in a long line of hard-working men and women who have come to Alaska to seek their fortune in daring and often thrilling quests for copper, silver, and gold. And the state's most famous gold rush of them all happened just a few miles away. In 1896, gold was discovered just over the U.S. border in Canada's Klondike Territory. The easiest way for miners to get to the Canadian gold fields was through Alaska. Over the next 3 years, 100,000 would-be millionaires made the trip. It was called the Klondike Stampede, and the men who joined it were known as Stampeders. A little harbor outpost called Skagway became one of their main points of entry. Today, Skagway is a major stop on the Alaska cruise ship circuit. But back in the days of the Stampeders, one Canadian Mountie called it hell on earth. The Klondike Stampede transformed Skagway from a two-man camp into a lawless boomtown of 10,000, almost overnight. Thieves, con men, and prostitutes prowled its streets, preying on the hopeful miners that arrived here with dreams of the riches that they hoped would soon greet them across the border. Future author Jack London was one of them. His time here inspired his best-known book, The Call of the Wild. He might recognize many of these storefronts if he came back today, and he might also be surprised at how much it's been cleaned up. But London and the rest of the Stampeders weren't just here to sample Skagway's debauched charms. They were here to start what was well known as a brutal journey to get to the gold. The shortest route from Skagway to Canada's Klondike gold fields was a narrow trail that headed west out of town and then north up a vertical incline. This grueling route was called the Chilkoot Trail and brought the hopeful prospectors to the 3,500-foot-high Chilkoot Pass at the Canadian border. To prevent starvation, Canada required prospectors entering the Klondike to bring a year's worth of supplies along with them, about a ton per person. If they showed up at the border crossing with anything less, the Canadian Mounties stationed here forced them to turn back. Toting all that stuff over the top of the Chilkoot's 3,500-foot summit in backpacks took multiple trips up and down the trail. The Stampeders called it the meanest 32 miles in the world. Today, remains of abandoned canoes still lie near the Chilkoot summit, just part of the extra baggage discarded along the way. Only about a third of those who tried the trip made it to the goldfields. The rest gave up, turned back, or died on the trail. Many miners chose an alternate route out of Skagway. This one, which headed up and over White Pass instead, was only slightly easier. Here in this valley, pack horses, not humans, paid the greatest price. Eager, inexperienced prospectors drove the horses relentlessly, then cast them aside in places like this gulch when they became crippled or ill. Their rotting carcasses were why Jack London referred to this route as Dead Horse Trail. To ease the suffering of both man and beast, and to make a tidy profit in the process, a group of investors decided to build a railroad over White Pass in 1898. The steep slope of White Pass made it a nearly impossible project, but the potential profits drove them on. "Give me enough dynamite," one engineer bragged, "and I'll build a railroad to hell." Dazzling feats of 19th century engineering, like this steel bridge, had to be built to carry the trains across the canyons that stood in the way. But by the time the line opened in 1900, the Stampeders it was built to carry were already gone. An 1899 gold strike near Nome had sent them northwest instead. Fortunately for the railroad's investors, settlers and sightseers soon took their place. Today, the White Pass and Yukon Railroad's trains still carry nearly 400,000 tourists into the mountains every summer. And over 100 years after the Klondike Stampede, prospectors are still fanning out across Alaska's backcountry to search for gold. And few are finding something else out here too. Their 15 minutes of fame on various gold mining reality shows. But they're hardly the first ones in Alaska to have the TV cameras come knocking or move in next door. That's what happened here at the home of former Alaska Governor and Republican vice presidential candidate Sarah Palin. In 2010, unauthorized Palin biographer Joe McGinnis bought the house to the left and announced he was moving in. So Palin built a 14-foot fence to block his view. But no fences were needed on the other side after Fox News built Palin her own TV studio in this building to the right. For 3 years, it kept Ms. Palin in the spotlight, a position she seems to adore, but one a lot of other Alaskans don't envy. From its earliest days, Alaska has been a magnet for a contrary brand of outsiders looking to be left alone. Today, their 21st century heirs still resent any intrusion into their lives. Distrust of the lower 48 and its federal government thrives in this individualistic and libertarian crowd, along with conspiracy theories. In 1993, the Department of Defense selected this lonely spot, 175 miles north of Anchorage, to build its High-Frequency Active Auroral Research Program, or HAARP. Soon after, Alaska's conspiracy blogosphere exploded. The U.S. government was accused of using HAARP's array of 180 72-foot-tall silver towers for everything from disabling satellites, to causing earthquakes, to controlling the weather, to controlling minds. The DoD's promises that the array is actually being used for a benign study of the outer atmosphere did little to stop the chatter, even though it's not the first time space-minded scientists have been drawn to Alaska's unique environment or its unique position on the Earth. Here on Kodiak Island's narrow cape, scientists even found a perfect spot to build a gateway into space. The Alaska Aerospace Corporation's Kodiak Launch Complex. This spaceport was built by the state of Alaska itself and is used by both the U.S. government and private corporations to launch unmanned rockets and satellites. First, they are loaded inside this 17-story tower and then moved outside just before launch. Since the Kodiak Launch Complex sits right next to the Pacific Ocean, it's the perfect and safest place to launch satellites into polar orbits, like many of the weather and communication satellites we rely on today. But not all scientists come to Alaska to train their eyes on the skies. Some are here to learn survival skills for an epic journey across miles of ice. High in the mountains above Juneau, a group of young scientists is preparing for a very cold scientific quest. They're about to embark on a 90-mile, 8-week research trip through the Alaskan wilderness to Atlin, British Columbia. But they're going to get there on skis by crossing the Juneau Ice Field. Since 1948, the Juneau Ice Field Research Program has been sending young scientists like these out onto the ice. They're here to pursue wilderness studies in fields such as geology, climatology, biology, and glaciology. This is their first stop, known as Camp 17. They will spend the next few days in this rugged outpost learning the techniques that will help them to survive the rest of the trip, like how to avoid falling into a crevasse and how to climb back out if you do. Out here, teamwork and strong arms are the key to survival. Once they finish learning the ropes, these hardy apprentice researchers will move on across the ice field. They'll join the ranks of thousands of other adventurous scientists drawn to Alaska over the years, eager to explore and understand the state's wonders. From high in the mountains to sea level, and even below. Southeastern Alaska's rugged coastline, with its mix of mountain, ocean, and shore, has long been a favorite destination for researchers from around the globe. Britain's Captain Cook was one of the first Europeans to chart these waters in 1778. More detailed scientific studies were carried out in the early 1800s when Russian scientists recorded data about tides and weather here. Their work led to the first maps of Alaska's confusing coastal regions. A tangled network of straits and channels with thousands of miles of shoreline and hundreds of islands. A few of them, like this one called Chickagoff, are huge and cover more than 1,000 square miles. Others aren't much bigger than rocks. For centuries, people have been using the waterways around them to travel up the coast. This inside passage allowed them to avoid the northern Pacific's dangerous waters. But the region's winding 10,000-mile shoreline brought dangers of its own. Hidden shoals and jagged outcroppings caused 300 maritime accidents in 1898 alone. The next year, Congress responded by authorizing the construction of a series of lighthouses. One of the first to shine its beam stood here on Sentinel Island. It's been leading sailors away from disasters since 1902. But its original wooden building was replaced with this sturdier concrete Art Deco tower in 1935. Today, only one of the Inside Passage's original 20th century wooden lighthouses survives. This lonely octagonal tower on Eldred Rock. It stands near the spot where the passenger ship Clara Nevada ran aground and sank on a stormy night in 1898. As many as 40 people lost their lives here that night. The Eldred Rock Lighthouse began operation in 1906 in an effort to make sure it never happened again. Its beacon still lights the way for ships sailing through the Inside Passage today. Up to a fifth of those are cruise ships, 450 in the summer of 2012 alone. Hundreds of passages by tankers, barges, and fishing boats help add to the total. But no ships make more journeys along Alaska's southern coast or play a more vital role here than the ferries they call the Blue Canoes. For many rural residents, they provide the only dependable link to the outside world. Private operators ran the first ferries here until the territory bought them in 1951. After statehood, a new federal law transformed these waters into the Alaska Marine Highway, qualifying the now state-owned ferries for federal support. That support keeps the ships chugging along from Bellingham, Washington to the tip of the Aleutian Peninsula and back, 3,500 miles each way. They carry 312,000 passengers and 98,000 vehicles in an average year. Cabins are available, but a lot of travelers prefer the view from the ferry's upper deck. From here, they can watch the spectacular scenery go by and look for signs of the birds, fish, and marine mammals that call the Inside Passage home. These sea lions rely on the passage's shoreline to rest and rear their young. They also depend on its water for food. A male can grow up to 2,500 pounds and rule over private domains where he awaits the arrival of 750-pound females willing to mate, if he's lucky. This fortunate bull's harem can barely squeeze onto his tiny beach. But despite their numbers here, Alaska's sea lions are actually struggling to survive. Once, these beaches in the Barren Islands would have been covered in a carpet of blubber and fur. Today, there's more sand than sea lion. Between 1960 and 1990, their population declined from around 140,000 to less than 31,000. Which is why, in 1997, they were added to the list of endangered species. Today, there are about 46,000 left. Farther from shore, the still waters of the Inside Passage hide another species on the endangered list, humpback whales. Gliding below the quiet surface, where they can stay for up to a half an hour at a time, they reveal their presence only when they come up for air. Humpbacks are part-time residents in these waters. They spend their winters around Hawaii, where they mate and give birth to their young. When summer comes, they head to Alaska to feed. It's the only time of year when they eat. Each one can consume up to a ton of fish and krill a day, but their predictable movements make them easy to track and kill. In the 19th and 20th century, whaling drove their numbers here down by 90%. Protected status has helped bring them back, but they still have a ways to go. Environmentalists long feared that growing ship traffic along Alaska's coast could interfere with the whale's revival. On March 24, 1989, their worst fears came true when a huge oil tanker called the Exxon Valdez ran aground on a reef here in Prince William Sound, where this buoy marks the spot. The impact tore a hole in the ship's hull. Up to 11 million gallons of crude oil poured out. It's been called one of the worst human-caused environmental disasters in history, but it was hardly unexpected. Environmentalists had warned of this kind of event for years, ever since the 1977 opening of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. The 48-inch pipe carries crude oil south from Alaska's Prudhoe Bay. It's specially built to be earthquake-resistant. The pipeline itself is not bolted to its supports. Instead, it rests on sliders. If the earth starts to rumble, the pipeline is designed to slide side to side and literally wiggle like a giant snake, instead of cracking and spilling its cargo of crude. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline runs for 800 miles across the state. Up to 15% of the United States domestic oil production flows through it every year and into these tanks at the marine terminal at Valdez in Prince William Sound, Alaska's northernmost ice-free harbor. From here, the oil is loaded onto giant tanker ships. Just after midnight on March 24, 1989, the Exxon Valdez left the terminal, passed this buoy at the mouth of the harbor, and headed out into Prince William Sound with a full load of crude when it suddenly ran aground. It was the largest oil spill in U.S. history at the time. Environmentalists on the scene predicted Prince William Sound would never be the same. 25 years and a $2.5 billion cleanup later, they've been proved right. Things look great on the surface here, but oil still lurks under almost every rock. Some areas are still as toxic as they were right after the spill. They may stay that way for hundreds of years, but that doesn't mean the cleanup efforts have all been in vain. Without them, things here would be much worse. But nothing in Alaska symbolizes nature's rejuvenating power or the value of human action to save the environment more than this. A once rare bald eagle standing sentinel beside the sea. In the 1960s, the unintended impact of a chemical known as DDT drove these great birds to the edge of extinction by making the shells of their eggs too thin. Public pressure forced the government to ban DDT. Today, the bald eagles are back. Inspiring reminders of what we can accomplish when we work together. Stirring symbols of America and living icons of Alaska. The great state where adventurers still pit themselves against nature, dreamers still come to seek their fortunes, and the call of the wild still echoes across America's last frozen frontier.